So I was reading a comment on YouTube. The particular one was by Roomglacial, and I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, "Don't become a Bitcoin maximalist. Bitcoin is the worst thing ever for the environment and this lovely planet." And I think that argument kind of would resonate with a lot of people. It's certainly the environmental concern aspect resonates with me. And because I can empathize with this viewpoint, I thought I would just throw out a few other points to consider before jumping to the same conclusion. The first point is that it's difficult to quantify the environmental impact currently from Bitcoin mining, but the large majority of it is done on renewable energy resources, as far as I can tell. The majority being done in China, where they have very cheap hydroelectric power that would otherwise be underutilized. So because of its cheap costs, that's where a lot of the mining operations are currently located, and that's what they're using. I know Iceland is also big in the mining scene, using cheap geothermal power. And then even in the US, places like upstate New York are really some of the most competitively priced energy. So there's a lot of Bitcoin mining operations going on there. I'm sure not all of the mining operations are using renewable resources, but I think even in that case, it's worth considering the indirect impact that Bitcoin mining has had on the energy market more broadly. And it now becomes feasible for economic arbitrage, so that supposing you have really cheap electricity in one area, due in part, say, to a hydroelectric dam, that can now be utilized, whereas before it was going to waste. And what this does is it increases the value of those projects, because now there's a base demand where before there may not have been. And so wind power and hydroelectric power are the beneficiaries of this. It will likely increase the number of wind farms and hydropower plants to get installed in the future due to this increased economic incentive on their part. That's obviously a good thing for the environment, and while it might not totally offset the detrimental impact of Bitcoin mining, I think we have to consider that as part of the whole picture, at the very least. So I'm not an economist, and I don't know how one would go about doing a study on the environmental impact and economic incentives created by Bitcoin mining. But just from my own personal experience, I know of two people who are considering investing in Bitcoin who haven't yet, and I think it's worth considering what their alternative use of that capital might be. And I know that an N equals 2 study is hardly representative, but I think it's interesting that in the case of both of them, they're not interested in purchasing stocks. The stock market has been on a long bull run and is now looking like it could be ready for some correction. And so for both of them, they've both expressed interest in buying new pickup trucks, which, as an alternative investment to Bitcoin, those hardly do anything better for the environment. So just drilling down a little bit further, on the one hand, you have sort of, I would call it a conspicuous consumption, which further drives more production of unnecessary resources. It's going to increase, to some extent, the demand for oil products, gasoline, diesel, while on the other hand, with an investment in Bitcoin, that essentially goes to the miners. The miners are incentivized to buy the most power efficient mining equipment they can and obtain the cheapest power they can, which again is largely renewables. And even in those cases, let's just look at the investment in modern ASICs. That's in turn going to increase the demand for production of more efficient electronics. Anytime that a manufacturer can come up with a new process that shrinks die sizes or increases power efficiency of integrated circuits, that's an economic benefit to all of us, because now we can all have more efficient electronics that's not just limited to Bitcoin mining. So I think that the total environmental impact of Bitcoin mining can't really just be looked at in isolation, and I don't know how you would go about finding out the true impact to society as a whole, but certainly if there's any economists out there, or maybe graduate students who would know how to begin to wrap their head around this problem, I think it would make a very interesting study, and it might not be nearly so bad as it seems when we first consider it. And just a final point I'd like to make is that while I do still share the concern about the total power consumption, that does seem pretty wasteful, I have done quite a bit of research, and frankly, the proof of work system that's utilized by Bitcoin and others is really the only one that is provably secure from the standpoint of game theory, where the Nash equilibrium results in all of the miners or the participants cooperating. And while I hope that we come up with alternatives to it, it's really the best bet we've got right now. And so I would just hate to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak, by rejecting proof of work and blockchains like Bitcoin out of hand without first really considering what it means to move away from the proof of work system.